Welcome to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series, brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. My name is Steve Damaris, and I'm the Taylor Chair in Applied Big Game Research and Instruction at Mississippi State University. Thanks for joining me. Population regulatory factors can be categorized into two groups: the density dependent, where the population size directly impacts the food supply, which directly impacts the health, in turn impacting the reproductive success and the survival of animals. Density independent regulatory factors are ones that affect the population regardless of the deer density because they are more related to weather. The amount of rainfall, the amount of snowfall during the winter, the temperatures during the winter, the temperatures during the summer, the amount of drought, the amount of flooding in a given year, all affect a population of deer. Both density dependent and density independent factors tend to impact the nutritional intake of the population. So density dependent and density independent tend to blend together into fairly complex interrelationships, but they tie back to the nutritional intake of the animals. I chose this particular photo of a doe and a fawn because you can see in this doe that she is malnourished. You can see the vertebrae from the backbone sticking out along her backbone. You can see that her hindquarter is poorly muscled. She is undergoing extreme nutritional deprivation. She has put what she can into the production of a single fawn because that's what her job is. She is to produce fawns. A healthy doe would produce two fawns. In this case, it's an unhealthy doe that produced one fawn. And this picture was actually taken from a population at maximum sustainable density. An unhealthy doe is producing a single fawn, and some of the does may not even produce fawns. We'll talk more about that later. Density-dependent regulatory factors tend to have a relatively greater impact as density increases. During the first half of that population growth, they're technically being impacted by density, but in no real significant way. Their health is still relatively good. Early in the population growth curve, density is having essentially no impact. But as density increases, the population size increases, there's a relatively greater impact by these regulatory factors. Deer health tends to decline via the action of one or more factors. And I've already talked about malnutrition being a consideration. That's a direct impact on health. An unhealthy deer that is not getting enough food cannot do its life stage jobs, what it's supposed to be doing at a given stage in its life. Malnutrition also reduces the resistance to diseases. And so an animal that is malnourished is also more susceptible to diseases and parasites. And because there are more deer around due to the greater density, there's a greater opportunity that the diseases will be spread from one animal to another. So this malnutrition and disease combine to decline the health of a deer population. Now, the actual way that they act on the deer population is by affecting reproductive rates directly or indirectly and increasing the risk of mortality. So the number of fawns being produced and then the risk of mortality after they're born and at later stages in their life. Density dependence is really a major population regulatory factor. I like this saying by King Edward II's huntsman circa 1380, "The head grows according to the pasture, good or otherwise." If there's good food, there will be good health for the animals, and healthy animals do what they're supposed to do, and they fulfill their genetic potential. A buck has a certain genetic potential for antler size and for body size at a given age. If he is on poor quality habitat, he will not be able to fulfill his potential for antler size and body growth. This buck is reaching up into some branches to pick up some food. It's probably not meeting its nutritional requirements for optimum growth. Population size has a direct impact on food supply. This fact is irrefutable and inescapable. When a population of deer is low or small, there's an abundance of deer food. As that population size increases, as indicated by the red bars, there is a decline in the quality and possibly the abundance of deer food. This is a direct relationship. There's no arguing this fact in most cases. How does that happen? How do deer impact the quality and ultimately the quantity of deer food? Well, the relationship between deer population and the quality of food can be understood by looking at the forage class variation in quality. And in this particular slide is some data we collected during July, which is one of the toughest months of the year from a nutritional standpoint in the southern United States. And LCP refers to the lower coastal plain, so this is one of the lower quality soil regions in the southern United States. So one of the worst regions from habitat quality standpoint. But the point I want to make here is the variation in quality among the different forage classes. Legumes are the member of the bean family. They are a forb, but I broke them out from forbs in this case because they're kind of a superfood from the deer standpoint. Legumes in July are around 14 to 15% crude protein. Forbs are only 10 to 11% crude protein. Woody vines, like this trumpet creeper in the photo below it, they're around 9% crude protein. The leaves of upright woody plants are even lower still, around 8% crude protein, and then grasses are way lower at around 6%. So if a deer is trying to meet its nutritional needs while he's growing antlers or while she's in late stage gestation or early lactation, a deer is going to need to eat higher quality forage. And the way they do that is because they are selective forages. They sample and evaluate a variety of plant species to meet their needs. They figure out the best stuff in the habitat that you provide for them. And they're going to select the more digestible, the higher quality species and parts of a plant. They're going to eat the best stuff out there and not eat the lower quality stuff. As a population increases in size or density, the relative abundance of these higher quality plants tends to decline. And there are actually plant species that cannot essentially be found in the southern United States now because of decades of overpopulation by deer have essentially eliminated them. And I'm sure there are plant species in the northern United States that are also no longer existing in most native situations because of deer overabundance. Here's an example of a case where the relative browse pressure indicates the population density relative to optimum nutrition. This is greenbrier or smilax. The picture on the left is a very healthy stand of greenbrier. The picture on the right is a picture that I took on a property that had way too many deer, and this is also a stand of greenbrier. Do you think this stand of greenbrier is as healthy as the one on the left? I hope you see that it is not. And if you are a selective foraging deer who's looking for the best quality forage to eat, it's already been eaten in this right-hand picture. There's none left. It's too late. There's no food of quality left. And they're not going to do very good eating the remainder of those stems, those hard, non-digestible stems, and they're sure not going to do very well eating those pine needles, those dried brown pine needles. Here's a picture of an extreme browse line, and one of my friends and biologists here in Mississippi showing a browse line on muscadine and also on a sweet gum. Now, muscadine is a moderate quality plant. If you see a browse line on a moderate quality plant, that indicates a very significant overpopulation relative to the food supply. And if you see a browse line on sweet gum, oh my goodness, you have very significant overpopulation. And you can see in the circle that I placed there, that oval, you can see where the deer have reached up and actually bitten individual leaves of sweet gum off of that tree. This deer population was in terrible condition. It was extremely overpopulated. Here's another example of dewberry in a overpopulated deer population. Dewberry is a moderate quality, moderate to high quality vine. And if you see this heavy use, in other words, all of the leaves have been bitten off of that dewberry plant, that suggests that there are way too many deer. If you see a cedar tree being eaten, oh my goodness, you have a major, major problem. So we use an evaluation of the browse use on a population on a property to evaluate the relative condition of the property, the relative deer numbers. If you're seeing cedar and sweet gum being browsed and a browse line on muscadine and this browse pressure on dewberry, you have a real problem. You are well on the right-hand side of that population growth curve, and you're possibly at maximum sustainable density. And in fact, if your deer are eating cedar, then you are way past maximum sustainable density. They are not being sustained very well at all. So a deer overpopulation will impact forage growth. This photo dramatically indicates plants on the right-hand side, the far side of that fence. There's no deer inside that fence. You can see what the vegetative community looks like with no deer, and you can see what it looks like on the left-hand side outside the fence where there are deer. A healthy plant community equals a healthy deer population. If you want deer to be healthy and have good reproductive rates, to have good antler size, you have to have healthy plants, healthy vegetation for that to happen. It is very typical to see a decline in reproductive success or recruitment as deer density increases. This graph, this figure shows fawn production from low to high, and when you have a low density, you have high quality deer, and they produce a lot of fawns. As density increases, the does are becoming unhealthy, and they are unable to produce fawns, perhaps none at all. And the same type of relationship is seen when we look at survival and how it's affected by density relative to carrying capacity. Survival rate on the left axis, the vertical axis, from low to high. When deer density is low, the deer that are produced, that are living in that healthy vegetative community, are healthy, and their survival rate is very high. As density increases and the quality of the habitat declines, the deer become unhealthy and their survival rate declines. This is a fairly complicated representation of age-specific reproduction and survival focused on the female side of a population, and it helps us understand kind of schematically what's happening in a deer population relative to these two main drivers of population growth: relative reproduction and relative survival. If you look at that top left-hand corner, you'll see those three lines that we started with a while back. And what I'm describing in this slide is basically that first half of the left-hand side of those lines where we have optimum conditions. We do not have a very dense deer population yet. We still have very high quality, and the population is growing at a very rapid rate because of the high health of the population. So what's happening here, we have mature adults at the far right-hand side producing a lot of fawns, and that big yellow arrow going back is the production of fawns. Those fawns are surviving very well and turning into yearlings, one-year-old deer. In a really optimum conditions, yearlings will actually breed and produce fawns, and so that yellow arrow back from the yearlings shows yearlings producing fawns themselves. Then you have 2-year-old does that are producing fawns also, but they're not producing fawns as effectively as a mature adult, so their yellow arrow is not as thick as the mature doe's arrow. Now, on the lower survival side of this figure, you see fawns surviving well as yearlings, yearlings surviving well into 2-year-olds, 2-year-olds surviving well into 3-year-olds, 3 surviving well into 4. And once you get to that 3-year, you're in that mature adult, and you could live to 12 or 13 years of age under optimum conditions. And so in this situation, nutrition is permitting maximum recruitment and survival, and you have the rapid rate of growth because the deer that are alive are really healthy, and does are producing their fawns to the maximum ability, and bucks are growing their antlers as big as they can because they have plenty of food to grow antlers. Further on in time in that population growth curve, those 3 lines up in the top left-hand corner, after you've peaked in the net addition, that deer production starting to decline because the quality, the health of the deer is declining pretty dramatically at this stage, even though the population of the deer is still going up. The red line, the deer population size is still increasing, but the health of the deer and the net addition of new deer into the population each year is actually going down at this point. And that's represented by this figure. And here, the yearlings are not producing any fawns because they're not healthy enough. The fawns that are being produced are not surviving quite as well. The yearlings are surviving well into the 2-year-old, and 3-year-olds as well as that. The survival is primarily being impacted at the fawn age class. The reproduction is a little bit lower in the 2-year-olds and non-existent in the yearlings now. The mature does are still doing a pretty good job of producing young, maybe not quite as well as before. And the younger age classes are being harmed the most in terms of their reproductive recruitment. So declining health reduces the recruitment or the production of fawns in the young animals and reduces their survival. That's what's happening at this stage in the population growth rate shown in the upper left-hand corner. Now, when you get close to that maximum sustainable density, you have extremely limited habitat quality, and the health of the population is extremely hindered. See that blue line going all the way down to the bottom at the end at maximum sustainable density. What's happening here is density dependent regulatory factors are regulating the population. The deer are unhealthy, there's nutrition problems, there's disease problems that are impacting the recruitment and survival of those animals. So the fawn production rate for mature does is way down. It's much thinner line now. The 2-year-olds are barely even able to produce any fawns. The survival rate of the fawns that are produced is very low. Once they become a yearling, they can survive pretty well, but probably the mature does are not now living as long as they might have under other circumstances. So this just represents what's happening within the doe population at this stage in the population growth curve. Now, that's all theory, and it's theory based on knowledge. And now I'm going to start showing you some of the knowledge that we have to prove these relationships. This is a study published in 2000. It was a study of roe deer productivity, and think of that as health. And they studied the roe deer productivity. Now, roe deer is basically Europe's equivalent of a white-tailed deer. The only difference between roe deer and white-tailed deer is that a roe deer female can produce up to 3 fawns when she's healthy. A white-tail adult doe is only going to produce normally 2 fawns when she's healthy. And so if you look at this relationship between population abundance on the lower axis, the horizontal line, there's 4 numbers down there. This was a study conducted of a deer population where there had been hunting and the population was maintained well below 100, and the ability to hunt the deer population ended. And so the scientists monitored the deer population. The first year they monitored it, there were 81 deer in the population, and the fawns per adult female was 2.5. So each adult female produced on average 2.5 fawns. So if you had 10 adult females, you would have 25 fawns being produced by those 10 animals. The next year, they sampled the population. They estimated there were 154 roe deer in the population. The adult does, the adult females, had a productivity of 2.2 fawns per adult female. So if you had 10 does, they were producing 22 fawns. The third year of the study, there were 244 deer. And here the adult does are now averaging 2.1 fawns per adult doe. The fourth year of the study, 276 deer were present, and now the adult does were only producing 1.7 fawns. So you can see over the 4 years of this study, when hunting was removed from the population, it increased from 81 to 154 to 244 to 276. That's a dramatic increase. That's more than tripled the population in 4 years. And all that time that it's being tripled, the reproductive rate per adult doe is declining. So here's a clear case of increasing density or population size driving down the food supply, which in turn drives down the health of the does and their success at producing fawns. Reproductive productivity declines with density as the abundant deer damage the forage supply. Here's another study from Europe published way back in 1985 looking at red deer. And this is the production of young red deer or calves per 100 hinds. A hind is an adult red deer. And the study encompassed a range of densities. From 50, you see 50, 100, 150 adult females present in the population. And so this is just the number of adult females, which is indicative of the overall red deer population. And as the population of adult females increased over time, each of those diamonds, those blue diamonds, represents a year, and the calving rate per 100 hinds in a particular year. So when there were only around 50 adult females in the population, they were producing 40 to 55 calves per 100 hinds. When the population increased to 100, the calving rate was now down around 30 calves per 100 hinds. When it got out to 150, it's down into the 20s. 20 calves per 100 hinds. Again, you see a dramatically declining reproductive success, a decrease in the production of young deer as the density of the adult animals increased, and those more dense adult animals damaged the forage supply. This figure shows how increasing density increased the winter mortality of young red deer within that same study. Those same blue diamonds represent years of the study. They monitored the winter calf mortality rate associated with adult female abundance. Think of it population size or density. At lower abundance of the deer population, the winter calf mortality was very, very low, down less than 5%. At higher rates of abundance, when you get out to 150 adult females on the landscape, you see the winter calf mortality out around 20 to 25%. So clearly another example where increasing population density damaged the forage supply, and in this case, it increased the winter calf mortality. It increased the risk of mortality. The previous slide showed it could decrease this reproductive success. Those are the two mechanisms whereby malnutrition can impact a population. Decrease recruitment or reproductive success, increase mortality of young animals. Now, there's a really interesting consideration called compensatory effects of density-dependent regulatory factors. I've been talking about density-dependent regulatory factors, how nutrition, haven't really talked much about disease, but density increasing decreases the health of the deer population, increases mortality, decreases reproductive success. Now, if you remove animals from the population through, say, harvest, you can have compensatory effects of that harvest removal, and it compensates by having increased reproductive success or increased survival otherwise. So presence of one regulatory factor, such as hunting, harvest removal, can actually compensate and have less of an effect of regulatory factors impacting other considerations. So this is an example from Central Texas from my days when I lived and worked in Texas. Two properties. One, property A, had a doe harvest rate of 30%. They estimated the number of does in their population, and they went about harvesting 30% of the does every year. And their fawn crop ranged from 25 to 50%. Now that's relatively low by southeastern standards, but that's not a bad fawn crop for Texas. Fawn crop in this case represents the number of fawns per doe, and it's not just adult does, it could include yearling does. So 25 to 50% fawn crop. If you see 10 does, yearlings, 2-year-olds, 5-year-olds, you see 10 does on a property, you might see 5 fawns. Property B is a property where the landowner didn't believe in harvesting their doe population, and they harvested none of them. And so there was no regulation through hunting, and so other mortality factors had to come in and compensate. The loss of harvest was made up for or compensated for by a lower fawn production. It's kind of like if you're old enough to know the old Fram oil commercials, you can pay me now or pay me later. Property A was paying you now, removing does, having recreational harvest for the does, and they had a good fawn crop following that, compensated because of the doe removal. Property B did not remove does, and so the health was not compensated, and so they had low fawn crop. Compensatory effects. Each action produces a reaction in deer management. This very simple figure represents habitat and a seesaw showing deer herd health on one end and deer herd density on the other. Each action produces a reaction. If you decrease the herd density, you will increase herd health and have compensatory improvement in reproduction and survival. If you let deer herd density increase, then you will have the reaction of a decline in the deer herd health. Each action produces a reaction. Lack of harvest to control the herd density is an action, it's a choice, and it produces a reaction, which is a decline in herd health. So typically, regulatory factors that are density dependent are compensatory. One action is compensated for in another action. However, compensatory effects are not always obvious. Deer populations on really poor quality soils, and by poor quality soils, I'm talking about soils that are relatively sandy and do not hold a lot of nutrients in them, and they don't hold the water when it rains. The rain percolates through it, and the soils dry out quickly after a rain event, and there's not many nutrients in the soil, so the plants can't really grow very well in response to that rainfall. And typically, deer populations on really poor soils have an abundant low quality vegetation. There might be lots of green vegetation, but it's not good quality vegetation. It's there because there's sunshine, enough sunshine reaching the ground to have some green vegetation, but it's not quality enough to support a healthy deer population. And so if you try to remove and decrease the density or decrease the population size in this situation, they may not be able to respond with compensatory effects by increase their fawn recruitment because they had a lot of low quality vegetation before the population reduction. They reduced the deer population and they still have a lot of low quality vegetation. And so the quality doesn't increase in this case because the quality of the vegetation is tied back to the low quality of the soil. So you do not have an increase in deer health associated with reasonable harvest rates. And this was shown in a study in northern Florida back in the mid 90s. They looked at two large areas, very large areas. One of the areas they had no doe harvest, and the other area they implemented a very heavy doe harvest to reduce the deer density. And they didn't measure density per se, they measured the relative abundance. And they did that by measuring the number of tracks crossing dirt roads per mile. So where there was no doe harvest, there were about 12 tracks per mile of dirt road. How many deer that, equates to, I don't know. But there were a whole lot more deer in the no doe harvest area than there were in the heavy doe harvest area because only about 3 tracks per mile were found in that area. So heavy doe harvest significantly decreased the abundance of deer. Looking at the reproductive success, you would expect, given compensatory effects of density-dependent regulation, if you greatly decrease the deer population, you should have an improvement in the quality of the vegetation, the quality of the habitat. You have greater health of the does, and they're going to respond with an increased reproductive success. In this particular case, there wasn't. There was no increase in the number of fetuses per adult doe. So essentially, in this type of low quality soil with abundant low quality browse, you decrease the density, the number of does on the property. You won't necessarily increase the reproductive success of those does, and all you will have is fewer deer and not better quality deer. That can be a real problem, and a wildlife biologist will understand the relationship and the habitat potential for an area and know when and where density dependence can be expected to respond and have increased reproduction and decreased mortality. We've been talking about density dependent regulatory factors. The second type of regulatory factor is density independent, and this has to do with the weather. Talk about extreme weather. We've had some in Mississippi, along the Mississippi River. We've had some serious flooding on either side of the Mississippi River. This is the results of a study we did in cooperation with the Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks Department and Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries Department. They both run successful DMAP programs, collect a lot of data on properties along the river. And we did an analysis of the relative amount of flooding in 61 properties along the river, from Tunica, Mississippi, all the way down to Baton Rouge. 61 different properties. Most of them had similar management approach. And along that river there, most of the properties are managing for trophies. So they're interested in producing older, aged, larger antlered bucks. And we looked at the response of relative flooding at different times of the year and the amount of flooding. I won't get into any great detail here, but I will show you some of the changes in doe body weight at 1 year of age. This is that first year of growth of the doe before she started to have fawns, and it's a really good indicator of deer population health. Now, what we're showing here are pounds of change from 1 year to the next associated with a given flooding event or weather event. The far left-hand side shows two green histograms. They're associated with winter flooding 1 year prior and winter flooding 2 years prior to the year that it was measured, tended to increase the weights of yearling does 4 pounds and 3.5 pounds based on winter flooding 1 and 2 years prior. If it was a year where there was summer flooding 1 year prior, you tended to have a decline in doe body weights the following year of about 2 pounds. If you have high temperatures during the summer, you could have a drop of over 2 pounds, a loss of over 2 pounds during the current year. If you had back-to-back hot summer years, so 1 year prior, summer heat could drop body weights 2.5 pounds, and the current year's hot summer could drop another couple of pounds in the doe weight. So these are cases where weather, the temperature, and the amount of rainfall and ultimately flooding are examples of density independent regulatory factors that are affecting the health of a deer population. We also looked at changes in lactation rate of 3.5 and older. These are the mature does, the prime producers. If they're still lactating, then that means they raised at least one fawn. So we use lactation rate as a gross indicator of reproductive success. 0 and above is an increase. 0 and down in red is a decrease from 1 year to the next. So same relationship here. If you had winter flooding 1 year prior, you tended to have an increase in lactation rate. And if they had a winter flood 2 years prior, there was about a 6% increase in lactation rate. So if you had a year prior winter flood, 2 year prior winter flood, you had positive improvements in lactation rate in subsequent years. If you had a spring flood 1 year prior, the far right of this figure, you would have an increase in lactation rate the next year. If you had a significant amount of summer flooding the current year, you could lose up to 14% lactation rate that year. And so that's a significant drop in reproductive success from the current flooding. So again, weather events affecting when flooding takes place, affecting reproductive rates. It didn't matter how many deer were there necessarily. The flooding was going to take place regardless. Now, I've pointed out 1 year, 2 year prior. What's with this time lag thing going on here? Well, there's a 1 year and 2 year time lags because of the effect of flooding And this is an actual picture I took on a property that had been heavily flooded, and you can see the silt has been deposited and the plants are growing back out. This is about a month after the flood had receded, and the plants are actively growing. Well, it takes a while after something is changed for vegetation to respond. In this case, it took them a while to start growing. If you decrease the density of a deer population, it's going to take a while for the vegetation to respond also. And so it's not unusual to see a time lag in a density dependent effect also. And this is one of those cases where that relationship with the density independent regulation, weather, is affecting vegetation growth. And so it's really affecting nutrition. And so the vegetation take time to respond to the flood, and a very recent flood, the vegetation hasn't been able to respond yet. If it's a year or 2 years prior, that siltation that took place due to the flood is essentially fertilizer, and that fertilizer is going to stimulate growth in subsequent years. And then the animals respond to improved nutrition. And that's why we have these 1 and 2 year time lags.